So welcome. Thank you very much for coming on this Friday afternoon. We're extraordinarily pleased to have with us today Professor Huang Yasheng of MIT's Sloan School of Management. Professor Huang first came to prominence during the 1990s with really a series of books and many, many articles about the political economy of investment and capital flows in China's transition from plan to market. And it was indeed at that time that I first became acquainted with his work as a PhD student on the other side of the country, reading about such topics. In particular, his book, Selling China, on the politics of foreign direct investment during China's long boom from about 1994 to 2008. The book came out in 1998, but it really does cover all of that period very, very well. Remains one of the top books on that subject and period, even now 25 years later. Since then, he's worked on several other aspects of Chinese political economy, and now today is going to talk to us about a new book called East, which is Examinations, Autocracy, Stability and Technology in China's Politics and History. So please welcome Professor Huang.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I should say that as my talk would make it clear, we couldn't do this project without Cambridge University, specifically without Joseph Needham. And we base our work on history of technology in China on Joseph Needham's work. And Needham has an institute here, right? But I was told that the institute is actually separate from Cambridge University. Nevertheless, Needham himself was a professor here and did pioneering work, first in biochemistry and then in history of science. So, yeah, the book, which will appear on the screen momentarily, the estimated publication date will be August this year. There's a delay in the publication because the pandemic apparently has caused a paper shortage. So I no longer read paper versions of books, so I couldn't quite relate to that problem. But then the university presses insist on publishing the electronic and the paper versions simultaneously. So I began to give talks with the anticipation of the publication date around March. So this is a little bit early. I hope you don't mind. And so there are 4 big topics in the book that I'm going to cover. And the coverage is very broad. And then it's broad in a number of ways. One is that I try to cover both history and today. And the book alternates between history and contemporary China. So it's broad in terms of its historical coverage. It is also broad topically. 4 topics: exam, autocracy, stability, and technology. So the book roughly is about how these 4 forces of politics and economy shaped Chinese history and continue to shape China today. Right? So that's kind of the main idea of the book. It is partially descriptive. We assembled database on history, on technology and history. It's also analytical. I'm going to introduce an analytical framework that ties these 4 topics together. And at the end of the book, I also try to be prescriptive, try to come up with policy prescriptions and how, because I'm based in the United States, so mainly I talk about the US policy toward China, how we can have a more productive approach toward China. And so it has this sort of, the breadth is also defined by the methods, right? Descriptive, analytical, and prescriptive. At least that's my intention. I may fail in delivery, and I leave to the readers to decide when the book comes out whether I succeed in these three tasks. So my own work is really mostly about China today, and China defined very narrowly, China since 1978. So I have to say I came into this topic with a disadvantage of not being a historian, and so there are going to be there are a lot of catch up for me to write a book partially on history, and we have been doing this for a number of years. I co-authored a paper with Claire Yang at the University of Washington. It is about the exam system, how the exam system improved the political stability of Imperial China using the data from the Ming Dynasty on the exams. So a lot of the ideas about the exam in my book came from the work that I did with Claire Yang. And then we have another paper on the Great Divergence. And this one is about political divergence, roughly, divergence between Europe and China, roughly around 6th century. And then another paper with Claire and others on the Great Tang Song transition. And most importantly, I'm working with a number of Chinese academics on a book project, Needham Question. And this is using the database we have built, and I'm going to introduce the database later on, to analyze the history of Chinese technology. And it is under contract with Princeton University Press. So I don't claim to be a historian, but at least I have tried to reduce my ignorance about Chinese history by doing some of these projects. But Chinese history is complicated, vast, and long, and there's no way I can discuss and talk about Chinese history in a way that a professional historian does. I try to do it in my own way. So let me acknowledge that shortcoming. Let me present the outline of the book. By the way, I'm also used to being interrupted. So if you want to ask a question during the presentation, please feel free to do so. I often tell people that I'm academic. I'm used to being treated rudely. In fact, at MIT, that's how people talk to each other. And when I gave my first seminar talk at MIT, I put up the first slide, and there was a question from the audience. The question is, why are you doing this topic in the first place? So far, we have made it to 4 pages without the question, so I feel good about that. So the book starts with an introductory chapter, essentially unpacking the East model exam, autocracy, stability, and technology, followed by part 1 on exam. The first chapter is on the civil service exam in history. The second one is about Chinese Communist Party today as a sort of a meritocratic organization, its personnel management, and how the Kuju might have influenced the way that the CCP operates as an organization. And then part 2 is autocracy. Chapter 3 is about imperial autocracy. Chapter 4 is about CCP today, and getting more autocratic as we talk. Chapter 3 is on stability. Part 3 is on stability, and chapter 5 is about how stability in Asian China improved over time as indicated by a number of measures that we have constructed. And then followed by a chapter on the stability during the CCP era. And there, I argue that CCP benefited from many of the lessons and legacies from historical China, except in one area. And this is the area of making a transition from one leader to another. Because in Imperial China, the oldest son would normally inherit the throne, but under CCP, at least as far as we know, until now, it is not hereditary succession. It may happen, like North Korea. So that's actually one weakness that the CCP system has. And I would argue that that weakness is getting even more pronounced now Xi Jinping is in his third term without any successor in sight. And then technology. One chapter is about historical technology. The other is about how to explain the success of science and technology in China today. And then the book ends with kind of prescriptive and forward-looking chapters. One on Xi Jinping, the CCP of Xi Jinping, and the other is purely speculative whether or not at some point China may break out of this East model. Right? So just to give you the outline of the book. So the book, covers a lot of topics. It's 400 pages long, so I'm not going to talk about the whole book. What I'm going to do in the presentation today is I'm going to introduce the kind of the conceptual framework, which is really necessary because there are so many different topics, and we need some concepts to tie up these topics together. It's a very simple way of analyzing the world, what I call scale vis-a-vis scope. And later I'm going to come back to that. And then I'm going to focus on two letters only. Right? There are 4 letters in the book. I'm going to focus on 2 letters in my talk. One is on the exam. I'm going to go into the civil service exam, Kuju. And then look at how Kuju had an impact on technology in Chinese history. And then explain why and how the Communist Party of China, under autocratic conditions, can achieve some success in technology and some success in science. So these are the 2 topics I'm going to focus on. And then end with, again, speculatively about implications, right, for the future. Okay, so let me introduce the simple concept, conceptual framework. And the idea there is that a nation, a country, a political system, an economic system always faces conflicts or trade-offs between its scale and its scope. Right? Scale, we can use scale to refer to the size of the geography, the size of population, the size of the government, the size of the bureaucracy, right? Or we can use it to refer to intangibles, right? Such as political commitment, such as policy support, right? Such as spending on research and development, government expenditure, right? The size of the government expenditure. So basically, it's implied in the concept this notion of homogeneity, right? Sort of same thing multiplied by many units. $10 billion, $10 trillion, 1.4 billion people, 1.3 billion people. Right? It's a simple idea there. A scope implies heterogeneity, right? So different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic conditions, and different ideologies, different ideas, different political parties, different ownership forms, right? And one can argue that China before reform had a centrally planned economy. It was less heterogeneous because it only had state ownership. And now it is more heterogeneous because it has state ownership, private ownership, and foreign ownership. Right? So, I mean, it's really simple ideas, but I find it useful to use this way of analyzing history and today in China. This is not from me. This is from Alexina and Spallor in their book, The Size of Nations. And what they postulated in the book is that there is an intrinsic conflict between scale and scope, right? So there are benefits of size, right? When you have, economy of scale, large companies derive benefits from economy of scale when they produce many units of the same thing, right? And government also benefits from economy of scale when they provide public goods, right? But the problem with that is that as the size gets big, there are more heterogeneous preferences and groups and organizations in the population, right? So some people may want welfare, and other people may want tax cut, right? So that's more difficult when you have very different preferences from the population. Their work focuses on kind of working on the mathematical model where the optimal balance between the scale and scope is. But the inside of that is you don't want to go too much on either side, right? If you have too much scale, you get stagnation and decline. If you have too much scope, you get chaos and instability, right? So I think the idea is that you want to sort of strike it somewhere in the middle to balance both the costs and benefits of scale and scope, right? And so that's kind of the gist of my argument. If you look at countries or one single country during different periods, they tend to be more successful when they get this balance right. And they are not successful when they don't get this balance right. By right, I mean it could be economic success, technological development, economic growth, GDP growth, or it can be political success, right? Stability, protection of rights, and things like that, okay? Technology and inventions also depend on getting the balance right, right? So as we know that modern science and technology are extremely expensive, right? Require government support, very often require government support more than what private corporations can do, right? And it also requires organization. In the United States, there's a whole set of organizations to administer the government spending on science and technology. National Science Foundation, National Institute of Health, national laboratories, and things like that. In China, right, so China, later on I'm going to show you some data, China spends a lot of money on R&D. And China has a very formidable organizational apparatus to organize research and development activities made in China and things like that. So these are on the scale side. On Asian China, so I want to make a special note about Asian China because you may feel that, well, okay, so that describes contemporary governments, contemporary science and technology. Why would that describe the ancient technology and ancient inventions? So one way to think about the scale of the government there is employment. In our database, something like 50 to 75% of the technologists in Asian China were employed by the government. This is just a remarkable figure. And think about why that was important, even for ancient times, right? So in the ancient times, basically we all survive on minimum number of calories that we had to produce for ourselves, right? And it's called a subsistence living. Essentially, when you are hired by the government, employed by the government, you are free from these daily activities of having to put the food on your table, right? So arguably, government support was even more important to the ancient people than it is to people today, right? Scientists, even if they don't get support from the British government, they are not likely to starve to death, right? Whereas in the ancient times, you can think about situations where if you don't put the food on your table, then you cannot continue to exist. So there's an economic freedom to engage in creative activities, right? In Europe, as far as we know, there was similar support for creative people, Da Vinci, right? People like that, but mostly from private sector, from the rich noblemen and others. The scale, the private support of science and technology is unlikely to be as large as that for the government support, right? So there are just not that many rich people in the ancient times to support science and technology. So why scope matters for technology? I mean, maybe this is all common sense, but I do want to make sure that we are on the same page. So it's important, scope is important for creativity. There's a lot of psychological research that shows why creativity is a function of kind of exposure to different ideas, exposure to different cultures, exposure to unconventional knowledge, right? So, they use terms such as multiple cultures, incongruence of ideas that are conflicting with each other, and non-overlapping ideas, right? Ideas that don't overlap with each other. So modern experimental research shows that these multiple environments, multiple ideas, multiple ideologies, multiple exposures are critically important to creativity. So if you think, if you think about inventions, you can think about inventions as a product of creativity, and then the scope conditions, which means diversity, which means heterogeneities, provide the necessary, not sufficient, but necessary conditions for creativity. And Joseph Needham himself went as far as to claim that there is a real kinship between the scientific mind and the democratic mentality. Right? And what is the scientific mind? He means skepticism. Right? And then again, according to Joseph Needham, there's in both cases a basic skepticism. The skepticism of the experimentalist is mirrored in the skepticism of the voter. Right? So I find that quote really, really interesting. So basically, that kind of elevates the psychological research to a political level. Right? You need a democracy for science and technology to develop. And this is, by the way, a conventional idea, at least in the West. And many people believe that because China is not a democracy, therefore China is not inventive and China is not innovative, including Joseph Biden. Joseph Biden in 2012 gave a commencement speech at the University of Pennsylvania. He said, we don't need to worry about China. It's an autocracy. They don't have freedom of ideas, and there's no way China can catch up with the United States. I think he has changed his mind to be complete, and now he worries about China, right? So I'm going to explain that, right? So how come a autocracy can actually be so inventive, even if we believe in sort of the sources of creativity and the kinship between democracy and science? I believe that we have a way to explain why China could achieve success. So let me illustrate this scale or scope problem from an event in Chinese history. It is called Dazhexiang Rebellion, right? In 2009 BCE. And it is a rebellion that toppled the Qin dynasty, right? So what happened? What happened there was that there were 900 soldiers conscripted, and they were ordered to march from today's Anhui province to Beijing, right? So anybody who has some idea about Chinese geography would appreciate how far away these two places are from each other. But unfortunately for the soldiers, they had a flooding, and which delayed their trip, right? But under the rule of Qin dynasty, if you fail to arrive on time, you'll be executed, right? So that will give any rational actor a choice between certain death, right, because you're going to be late, and to rebel, right, which has a non-zero probability of survival. Anybody would, I think, would make the right choice, which is rebellion. And rebel they did, and they toppled the mighty Qing dynasty. So when I was a student pupil in China, so the teachers would tell us, gee, look at this example. Qing dynasty was really, really cruel and harsh. And then later on, economists say, well, it's not just about that. It's really about poor, poor incentive, right? It is a poor incentive because you're forcing them to choose between rebellion and death. I think the lesson is actually deeper than either of these two. And the reason why I don't believe harshness explained this is because there are many Chinese dynasties that were also harsh, right? So Qin is harsh, but I don't think it is categorically different from other dynasties. Incentive, Qin dynasty adopted legalism, right? Legalism is all about incentive, right? Legalists are exceptional in terms of their attention to incentive. So maybe other dynasties make that mistake, but I don't think Qin did. I think a more convincing explanation came from a Chinese writer. And he basically used this kind of size and scope idea to explain the rebellion. He didn't use those terms, but the basic idea comes down to that. If you look at the Qing state, right, before Qing conquered other states, it is relatively small, right? And this is a famous story, right? Then Qing reformed, and then they conquered 6 other kingdoms and ended the warring states period. And this is Qing dynasty, right? Much bigger than the Qing state, right? So this is where scale and scope idea comes in, right? It was several times the size of the Qing state, encompassed larger size, but also heterogeneous climate conditions. Right? So the rule that you have to be there on time might have made sense for the Qing state, but probably it didn't make any sense for the Qing Empire, right? And also within Qing Empire, you can have flooding, you can have arid climate conditions, right? So there are more heterogeneities in terms of the climate conditions. Whereas within Qing state, because it's so small, it's concentrated in one corner of the country, probably the climate conditions do not vary that much. And Qing ended up in a disaster, right? So I mean, I think it's a lesson that if you don't handle the contradictions and the conflicts of scale and scope well, you can end up in a disaster. So this is where I should come back to Kuju, right? What Kuju did was that it solved this scale and scope problem. Right? It was, so first of all, let me say, Kuju was a remarkable institution. The more I study the institution, the more impressed I become with it. It's very systematic, very well designed. Again, we're talking about 6th century, okay, so we're not talking about 21st century. It was a failure proof. Later I'm going to say exactly what I meant. It was efficient and powerful with clear objectives, clear routines, right? And it scaled the Chinese state and consolidated Chinese political unity, but by disseminating scope, essentially by getting rid of the scope. That's the Kuju solution, right? Scale at the expense, almost at the complete expense of scope, right? In terms of ideas, in terms of politics, in terms of ideology. The result of that is China had incredible long-run stability, and that was the paper that I wrote with Claire, right? Measured in many, many ways, but at a massive cost. Technology declined, and economic growth stopped, stagnated. Right? So it is, you could argue that Kuju didn't handle the scale and scope conflict well because it chose completely scale over scope. It ended up with a benefit, which is political stability, but it also ended up with a disaster, which is technological stagnation. So that's basically the idea of my book. For the contemporary period, during the reform era, which I define as from 1978 to 2018, right? The reason I define it as ending in 2018 is that's the year Xi Jinping abolished the term limit. Basically, I believe that that's the end of the reforms. So during that period, between 1978 and 2018, the Chinese Communist Party kind of arrived at an optimal solution of scale and scope, right? Scale, autocracy, right? Didn't undertake political reforms, one-party system, right? They maintained that. And they, in terms of science and technology, they invested massively in science and technology, right? China now has the second biggest expenditure on R&D, second only to the United States, right? China spends about $450 billion a year. US spends about $500 billion a year, right? China spends more than Japan. China spends more than all the European countries combined, right? So definitely China has the scale. Politically, it has the scale because it maintained one-party system. But also, the CCP under Deng Xiaoping implemented reforms, open-door policies that allowed international, there are Chinese students here, right? International collaborations and exchanges, foreign and domestic private capital, right? And some degree of social flexibilities, not completely free press, free media. But I think, as everybody here knows, that Chinese social media 10 years ago was relatively free. And China had Caijing and Caixin, very open financial press, right? Not political press, but very open economic and financial press. So, it has scope conditions, right? So basically, this is the way that we explain the success of China today in terms of technology and science, right? So they are scope conditions. And for science and technology, this piece is really, really important. For high-tech entrepreneurship, it is this piece that is really, really important. Again, feel free to interrupt me, if only because I want to drink some water. But since 2018, the scope conditions that are listed here, practically all of them collapsed. Right? So essentially, the way I think about China today is that it still has scale, right? Commitment to science and commitment to technology, semiconductor, made in China 2025, right? But China achieved success in technology and high-tech entrepreneurship with definitely government support, but also with a number of important scope conditions. Now China only has one, right, scale advantage. And I would actually argue that scale advantage is going to decline, but that's a separate conversation. And now only has one without the scope. So if I don't get there, let me just lay it out. I'm not as optimistic about the prospects of the country continuing to make economic growth, technological and scientific progress, as I was about China before 2018. Okay, so that's where I ended up in my book. Let me talk more about Kuju, right? How are we doing on time? Okay. Yeah, so when should I shut up?
It depends how much time you want to leave for questions.
Okay. All right, so let me go faster. So let me say a little bit about Kuju, right? So again, this is an ancient institution. It took many, many years to perfect itself. It was established by the Sui dynasty in 598. It is incredibly systematic. It has 3 tiers: provincial tier, metropolitan tier, and palace tier. It was held every 3 years on a regular basis, right? And candidates prepare for the Kuju through the preparatory system at the county level. And that was nationwide during the Ming Dynasty, right? So we're talking about 13th century China. During the Ming Dynasty, there were about 2,400 counties in China. And there were about 2,300 preparatory schools. So almost one per each county, right? I mean, it is just remarkable. This is centuries before universal education, right? And it had a anonymization protocol, right? So Chinese invented the double-blind review, right? Today, if you submit a journal to an article to a journal, right, you don't know who the reviewer is, right? That allows the reviewer to say nasty things about your paper, and the reviewer doesn't know who you are, right? Chinese invented that. It was double anonymization. The examinees' papers their names were covered. It's called a Huming Zhi, covered, right? And they were so careful because they were concerned, because they didn't have typewriter then, they were concerned that the handwriting might convey information about the identity of the examinee. So for each round of the exam, they hired something like 500, 600 scripts to copy the exams, right? Just to make sure to cut off the information flow between the examinees and the examiners. It was highly standardized, right? But by the Yuan dynasty, they adopted the curriculum on Neo-Confucianism, right? So now you take the exam only according to one interpretation of Confucianism, right? You couldn't write the essay, praising Confucianism according to another interpretation. You have to adhere to this interpretation. And also, this is very famous, right? Ba Gu Wen, the 8-legged essay. Many people are very critical of both of these things. But on the other hand, it's very important to remember, in the Ming Dynasty, each round of the Kuju had between 3 to 4 million participants. When you have so many people, you need standardization, right? Just to give you a sense how advanced. So Chinese also invented standardized tests, right? Double-blind review, standardized tests. Just to give you a sense of how far advanced China was. In 19th century, Harvard and MIT, they're very close to each other, had totally different exams. So there's no standardization between two universities that are a few blocks from each other. And also, at that time, they gave exams sometimes 3 weeks before the admission, sometimes 4 months before the exam, right? Whereas Kuju, regular every 3 years, national 3 tiers. This is just unbelievable system, right? Compare with the West. So, okay, so the protocol and the procedure are impressive, but what about the results, right? So Claire and I use a statistical method to estimate whether or not the exam performance was impacted by the wealth of the families of the examinees, right? I mean, just as a kind of a basic intuition, if anonymization doesn't work, you know the examinee is a rich person from a rich family, he might get a higher exam score, right? By the way, I use he because Kuju was only open to male Chinese. So what we can show is that the family health had no impact on performance. Again, this is just, if you compare the modern times, this is really a remarkable result. And it had a purpose, right? It was considered as a legitimate practice, legitimate institution. There were perceptions of objectivity and impartiality. These are very, very important things, because if you don't believe that the system is impartial, you don't have the incentive to take it every year, every 3 years, right? Because the exam requires so much effort, so much time, and so much energy to prepare, right? If you know that, some people are going to be favored, then you don't have the same incentive. So historians have demonstrated that the Kuju system, even though the odds of the success are very small, the participation is incredibly wide, 3 to 4 million people. And China achieved respectable literacy because of the exam system. In terms of ideology, right, the effect was also massive. Remember that it was standardized tests, right? Just one ideology, the most narrow interpretation of Confucianism. So essentially what the system did was it converged the Chinese elites to one ideology after Yuan. And that was the most controlling version of Confucianism, Neo-Confucianism. There was kind of this differential mindset to authority, to instructions from above, right? Remember Needham's argument that you need a skeptical mind to do science, and basically Kuju took care of that, right? Got rid of the skeptical mind. Memorization, right? So there are about 300,000 to 400,000 characters that you kind of have to memorize. I mean, just imagine memorizing so much text, crowded out anything that you can have the energy to do other than preparing for the exam, right? So the mental energy is simply not there, right? Investment of time, right? So, for Cambridge University, for MIT, young people probably will try to get in once, right? If they don't get in, maybe they will try it next year, but that's about it, right? Kuju, in our data set for the Ming Dynasty, the youngest person who succeeded was 13 years old. The oldest person was 69, right? So essentially you spent the rest of your life preparing for Kuju, right? Just think about from an emperor's perspective, right? You spent all this time, all these efforts preparing for the exam, and therefore it must be the case you spend less time preparing for other things, such as forming a political party, try to be a prime minister after Rishi Sunak, right? So you would downplay these other alternative activities, right? A stifled creativity, right? So think about the psychological literature about the importance of multiple ideas, multiple environments. Kuju took care of that. So when I say remarkable institution, I really mean the protocol and the operational features of the system, not the effect. The effect was quite negative on China. So let me quickly show some data. So time after time, Sui dynasty came up in our data as the critical turning point, right? In terms of technology, also in terms of stability, and a number of other measures. It was a pivot of political and technological developments. So let's just show the scaling effect of Kuju. So on the vertical axis, we have time. On the horizontal axis, we have the size of the geography. Basically, what this graph shows is that the later dynasties are also larger in size, right? The bubble is scaled to the size of the dynasty. And this is a measure of rebellions specifically by other elites, right? And this is the Kuju period, right? This is before Kuju, and this is after the Kuju, right? So clearly you see a dramatic drop of the frequency of the rebellions, arguably also some drop in the volatility as well. So what happened to the Chinese inventions? So on that, I need to just take a detour and talk about the data. So this is where Cambridge University is relevant. We constructed our database on the basis of Joseph Needham's 27 volumes of Science and Civilization of China, supplemented by volumes by Chinese Academy of Sciences, right? So the way that those volumes are, they just record inventions, describe the inventions. They don't have a list, so we have to read these volumes manually and extract the information from the text. Right? So it was a lot of work. So at one point, a collaboration with Tsinghua University. At one point, we had 44 researchers at Tsinghua University working on this. We had 10 researchers at MIT working on this, right? So currently, we have about close to 11,000 inventions, right? So just to give you a sense of the scale of the data, the largest data set on Chinese inventions in history had about 600 observations, right? We have more than 10,000, so there's just no comparison there. The tricky thing is sometimes the texts are not very clear about which dynasty invented a particular invention, so we have to come up with number of coding mechanisms to estimate the assignment. Okay? So some people may ask, what is an invention, and all of that. So let me just make it very clear. For us, an invention is whatever Joseph Needham says is an invention. It's just as simple as that. and we really don't have any independent expertise and judgment to say, oh, this is not an invention, that is invention. We don't have that. So treat our finding with some caveats. It comes with the benefit of Joseph Needham's volumes, but it also comes with maybe some of the lack of clarity. And also, we don't really make a distinction between science and technology, between innovation and invention, right? between a gadget, between a discovery, between a production method. We treat all these things as inventions. Our measure is Chinese dynasty inventiveness score. And basically, it's a very simple ratio. It's the inventions divided by population. Right? Inventions assigned to dynasty, it can be Han Dynasty, divided by the population estimates for that dynasty. Fortunately for us, Chinese historians have done a lot of work estimating. I think every time I walk there, it
disappears only if you look at it.
Yeah, I know. So, I think it doesn't mind you looking at it, but for some reason it doesn't like me looking at it. Professor Ge Jianxiong at Fudan University has come up with the most complete estimates of historical population. So we use his estimates. We also use other scholars' estimates to compare whether or not our results are affected by using different estimates. Unfortunately, there's not much difference. There are other measurement issues. I'll be happy to come back. And so one issue that I get a lot from the audience is, well, you're treating each invention the same as every other invention, right? And how can you treat gunpowder the same as something else? I have an answer to that, but in case you want to ask, we can come back to that. So again, come back to this scale and scope idea, right? So the idea here is that at one point in time, Asian China had both scale and scope, right? Scale, remember, the measurement for Asian China is employment by the government of the people, of the inventors, basically, okay? And it was, as high as 75%, as low as 50%. But over time, around 6th century, when Kuju was introduced, China wiped out, over time, its scope conditions. This is kind of like China under Xi, right? Which they had scale, but without a scope, right? And look at what happened to the technology. So this is before 6th century, basically from 5th century BCE to 6th century CE. And this is the average value of our invention measure, is essentially inventions per capita, right? And this is after 6th century, between 6th century and 13th century, a dramatic decline by the same measure. And then this is from 13th century to 20th century, another decline, right? Another decline. So so this is interesting because Joseph Needham, even though our work is based on his volumes, he would not have produced this graph. He believed that China began to decline here. Right? This is actually much earlier than what he believed when China began to decline. And so during this period, I think many of you know there, right? So we have warring states, right? Fragmented China, competing with each other, and then unified by the Qing dynasty for about 14 years. And then Han dynasty, also a big empire, right? Unified the China. And then a period that not many people know about, right? When I was growing up in China, I only knew about it because I read the novel《三国演义》, right? The romance of the three kingdoms. Right? That's basically my knowledge of that period, and really know nothing else about it. It turns out to be the most interesting era in Chinese history. Like warring states, fragmented, multiple governments. At one point, they were so it lasted about 360 years. There were about 30 governments, sort of sometimes one replacing the other, and sometimes coexisting with each other during the same period of time. Right? It was really, really much more fragmented, even compared with the warring states period. Right? And also foreign invasions from the northern tribes. And then in the 6th century, China got reunified under Sui, and then introduced the Kuju system. Right? So Kuju system itself didn't unify China. It was really Sui that unified China, and Sui invented the Kuju system, which kept China unified since then. Right? So now we have one-party rule in China, CCP. And before CCP, it was a nationalist government. Basically, that one-party system came from the Sui dynasty. Right? And whereas before, China was, just like Europe, very, very competitive, very, very fragmented. And then during this period of time, right, Kuju got really kind of very advanced, right? The 3-tier system, the anonymization system, and all of that, and the new Confucianism. So because of that, essentially the ideological scope conditions disappeared, right? So during this time, political scope conditions disappeared, right? One country, one government. During this period of time, ideological scope conditions disappeared. And look at what happened to our measure of technology. Scale, right? So this is employment by the government of inventors. The scale, indicated by the blue line throughout Chinese history. This is before the Qing dynasty. This is Qing dynasty. It fluctuated, but we're talking about 50%, 75%. It didn't. You don't see the kind of the collapse of ideology, collapse of political diversity in the scale measure, right? The top line is very interesting, the red line. It is the government employment of humanists, right? Writers, Chinese Shakespeare, if I can put it that way. Even more than inventors. Right? Chinese imperial state employed higher proportion of writers and poets as compared with the inventors. So this is our scale measurement. So essentially, okay, so when you see the scale remaining about the same, even though with some fluctuations, but then you see the scope collapsing, and then you see the technology collapsing, clearly it's not because of the scale, it is because of the scope, right? Yeah, so this is just a more refined look at the data that I showed you before. The warring states is here, quite respectable in terms of our measure. Qing and Han, also pretty good. And this is the Sanguo Yanyi period. The official name for that is Weijin Nanbei Chao. And then Sui. Tang is good, Tang is, and this is Song. Many people believe that the peak of Chinese technology was reached during the Song dynasty. And Tang was also very prosperous and cosmopolitan. Yeah, I think that's right. But, okay, so doesn't allow me to further illustrate my argument. But compared with the Sanguo Yanyi period, there's just no comparison, right? There's just no comparison. That was much more inventive as compared with Song and the Tang. And then Yuan was horrible, right? When you talk to Arabic scholars and ask them how come the science and technology failed to develop in Arabic countries, they always blame the Mongols. This is the Mongols, yeah. I think there's some story there too. Ming, right, and Qing practically disappeared. So this is correlation, not causation, but correlation can at least suggest causation. What that shows is that, so this is, on the vertical axis is the invention rate. On the horizontal axis is the geographic size, right? So, slight downward slope I mean, this is bivariate correlation, so we don't control for lots of things. What that shows is that the bigger the country gets, the less inventive it is, right? And there are two kinds of Chinese dynasties, the empire and the kingdom, right? So the kingdom are the smaller ones, right? So this correlation holds both among the kingdoms. The bigger kingdoms tend to be less inventive, as well as among the empires. The bigger empires tend to be less inventive, right? So Han is empire, but Han is much smaller than Yuan and Qing, and it is much more inventive, possibly as a result. And this is also interesting. And this is basically a Renaissance story. Humanistic creativity, and inventive creativity go with each other. We have a measure of the number of works divided by population. And the peak of humanistic creativity was also reached before Sui. There are two measures. One shows that to be the case, and the other shows it is Tang, right? So it's not completely in agreement with each other, the two measures. But then this is also when China reached its technological peak, right? So essentially, there's no, I mean, this is kind of what we often talk about, right? Liberal arts education is important for science, right? At MIT, we keep telling our students, you know, you take biology, you take computer science, but you also need to take English literature, Chinese literature, and music. We actually have, MIT has a very big school on humanities and literature, because these two things go together, right? So I think there is some evidence in Chinese history they also went together. So there was a collapse of political scope, as I pointed out before, right? During the Sangguo period, there were multiple governments, and then it became one. There was a collapse of ideological scope because of Kuju, right? And so this is interesting. So this is not done by us, but done by a number of Chinese historians. So Confucianism was famously adopted by the Han Dynasty as the official ideology. And many people believe that Confucianism was the dominant ideology, official ideology, because of that adoption. Right? So these historians compiled data to look at the Confucianist documents as shares of all the official documents, right? So if you say that Confucianism was the dominant ideology, then the share of the Confucianist documents must be very high relative to other ideologies, right? What's interesting is that, so this is the share of the Confucianist documents. This is Han Dynasty, followed by Sui, followed by Tang, and then another Tang. This is Song. Before Song Dynasty, the ratio, 39, 46, by no means dominant, right? To us, this is really interesting. Even though Han Dynasty declared the official ideology to be Confucianism, but if you actually look at the implementation of that declaration, it didn't really become dominant until Song Dynasty, 71%, 82%, 76%. Right? So it's consistent with the story we're laying out about the Kuju effect. Until you have this powerful platform, almost like a radio of the Sui Dynasty, right? Until you have this powerful technology to disseminate Confucianism, even if officially Confucianism is the official ideology, you can't really disseminate the ideology nationwide. Okay, so these two graphs show that Buddhism began to collapse during the Song dynasty. This is the red line is Buddhism collapsed, and Taoism collapsed after Yuan dynasty. Right? So essentially, by Ming dynasty, China just had one ideology left. Right? That's consistent with the prior graph that shows that by Ming dynasty, the Confucianist share of the documents reached as high as more than 80%. Okay, so quickly, let me conclude by talking about China today. So we draw lessons from history, right? The lessons from history are, I believe, that you need both scale and scope to succeed, right? So I hate to repeat myself, but I think that's it's worth repeating. Scale, right? So today, Ministry of Science and Technology, made in China, right? Scope, conditions, as I pointed out before, collaborations with the West were a scope condition. Private entry of private entrepreneurship, that was another scope condition. And China now, under Xi Jinping, still has a scale advantage, even though that advantage has been diminished, because US now is beginning to invest heavily in science and technology. So the relative, US was already spending more, but the gap between US and China was getting smaller. I predict the gap is going to get bigger in favor of the US, in part because Chinese economy is struggling. You just don't have the kind of resources now to support industrial policy programs as the government did before. And COVID policy definitely didn't help, okay? So on a minor point. So let me use Hong Kong as an example to show why the open door policy, a tolerant attitude toward Hong Kong, provided a scope condition for the success of Chinese high-tech entrepreneurship. Okay? I'm just going to focus on Hong Kong. In my book, I talk about academic collaborations, but here I'm just going to talk about Hong Kong. Hong Kong had rule of law, efficient financial system, and those things were vital for high-tech entrepreneurship from China. So the idea is this, right? Remember what I said about Joe Biden. Joe Biden in 2012 said that, oh, China is not innovative because they don't have democracy and freedom, they don't have rule of law. That's all true. But China then allowed Chinese entrepreneurs to access rule of law, efficient finance, and free press in Hong Kong, right? So that's, China itself didn't have those, but it allowed the Chinese high-tech entrepreneurs to access those conditions. Many of the prominent high-tech companies in China are actually registered in Hong Kong. Right? And these are the two resources you can go to and do further research. Some examples, right? The famous BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Two of the three are registered outside of China. Not just Hong Kong, but also outside of China. Other firms, SenseTime, Shangtang, at one point the highest, with the highest value of as an AI firm. Not true now because it has been blacklisted by the US. It was registered in Hong Kong. Zijie Tiaodong, the holding company of TikTok, registered in Hong Kong. And then in my book, I follow the case history of these life science companies, Beijing, Wuxi AppTec, and the Zai. Each one of them is registered in Hong Kong. In 2019, MIT Technology Review devoted the entire issue to China. Of the 9 companies so China at that time had 9 of the 20 biggest tech companies in the world. Of those 9, 6 of them are registered outside of China. Okay? So this is how we can get this thing wrong, by looking at some simple metrics. Right? So this is an article by Ezra Prasad, who is a professor of economics at Cornell University. He said, so this is during the Hong Kong protest, 2019. He said, well, China doesn't care about Hong Kong now because Hong Kong is so small. The trade now is only 12% of the trade, 1/30 of the Chinese GDP, as compared with 1997, it handled 50% of the Chinese trade, 1/5 of the Chinese GDP, right? So and I think this is also how Chinese leaders view Hong Kong, right? Maybe it was important before in terms of trade, in terms of GDP, but it's not that important now. But if you believe in what I was trying to tell you, right, it is only a slight exaggeration to say that Hong Kong owns the Chinese high-tech entrepreneurship space, right? So the importance of Hong Kong is way more than what is indicated by GDP and trade numbers. So my worry is that that's not sufficiently appreciated. And the Chinese leaders, as you know, basically demolished the autonomy of Hong Kong. It's not because they don't care about the economic consequences. It's just because they only look at GDP, they only look at trade. So other implications, I believe that undermining Hong Kong's autonomy also undermines this scope condition that China had for science and technology. Also decoupling from the West, right? Decoupling between China and the West also undermine the scope condition. If you look at Huawei before 2018 worked with 130 American companies. It worked with Zeiss in Germany to design its camera, right? And last time I was there in 2018, the chief strategist of Huawei is British citizen, right? Huawei is a classic example of a collaborative enterprise, right? That collaboration was key to Huawei's success. And my co-author and I, Fiona Murray, a British academic, we showed that the highest impact papers written by Chinese scientists are collaborative papers with foreign scientists. Okay, so let me just finish by saying that this is not ideology, right? Advocating, freedom of press and rule of law, and maybe some degree of democracy. It is based on at least my reading of history, our data, right? So this is fact-based rather than ideological based. Also, I think it is important for the West to recognize Chinese strength as well, right? This ability to scale technology, to scale support for science and technology. Very often we don't appreciate that. And the US has failed to appreciate that because US itself has not invested heavily in science and technology. So the West, I believe, has a lot to learn from China too. And also the West bought into this laissez-faire economics. Oh, market can take care of everything. The government is only wasting money. I think this is a very, very wrong way of looking at economic development. The right way to compete with China is not trade war or arresting Chinese American scientists. I don't know, people here know that under the China Initiative, Department of Justice arrested a number of Chinese scientists in the United States, including my colleague at MIT, right? But the right response is to invest in our own R&D and increase the coordination role of the government, right? And recent developments in the United States are moving things in the right direction. There's a CHIPS Act, there's Inflation Reduction Act, but we need more. And also, sadly speaking, who knows, by 2024, we may have glorious Donald Trump back in White House, and he's going to demolish all these accomplishments. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in the interest of time, we only have about 10 minutes. Rather than offering sort of a lengthy commentary, I'll just say two very quick things about what is clearly a very exciting and fascinating book, really, of great scale and broad scope. But the first is actually on that topic of scale and scope. If we think about that in sort of classic terms used of Chinese governance, it strikes me that scale reminds me of tiao and scope of kuai.
Oh, that's interesting.
In an interesting way. So we could map the same kind of two-dimensional space with tiao and kuai to analyze the governance dynamics of these different dynasties or even of China today, perhaps. The second thing I would just say by way of comment is that this is a really interesting example of the use of quantitative methods to study history. It seems, at least from what you've presented today. And that's a huge growth area in history in general, but it's an interesting application of it. And the quantification of something like Needham is no mean feat, as you pointed out, to read through 29, 27 volumes.
27, but also the Chinese researchers have quite a few volumes.
Yes, absolutely. At least as many, probably, if not more. So let's open it up for questions. I think what we'll have to do is take a bank of questions, maybe 5. Or 6 if there are that many, and then give you a chance to answer them, and then we'll move on to our reception that is to be waiting. So, yes. Actually, go to the back first. Yeah, already on your way.
Thank you for the lecture, Professor. I have 2 small questions. The first,
very briefly, yes, because we're really running out of time.
The most important questions. I find you using the CDI score indicator. I think using this indicator maybe includes the assumption that the number of inventions should be proportional to the size of the population. But is the total number of potential inventions unlimited under certain socioeconomic conditions? Well, what I mean is, was the overall total number of potential inventions limited prior to the Industrial Revolution? Can this explain the decline of the CDI score in Asian China? Thank you.
In the back and then over there, yeah. In the back, just there.
Just a very detailed question. What I understand is that although in Kuju, the students, the examiners don't know the students' names, but eventually, when the students succeed, they get to know the examiners and therefore form cliques. Is that correct?
Okay, I think there's one question over here. But for the recording. Yeah. Sorry about that.
The question is also about the CDI graph. I noticed the 5 dynasties, the period is also very low, and it's very similar to Three Kingdoms period. How do you explain that? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, great. And is there one last one, perhaps? Yes, just here in the front.
I'm supposed to point myself. I was just kind of wondering if you could elaborate on your understanding of how the Kuju is supposed to affect technological innovation. Are the effects kind of, limited to the people who are participating in the system, which is a lot of people, but if we compare it to the, as 3 to 4 million people participating in the exams in the Ming, in a male population and tens of millions of whom 30 to 40% might be literate, it's still a relatively small, potentially kind of proportion of people who are literate who are directly participating in the exams. So I was kind of wondering kind of how you understand the effects of the Kuju. Is it kind of limited, to the people who are participating in it, or does it extend beyond them? And if so, by what means?
Okay, great. So let's give you a chance to answer those questions.
Yeah, so I'll try to remember them. And so the one is about, 2 questions about the CDI. There's no assumption that there should be a fixed proportion, right? So we're free in terms of assuming whatever the proportion we can have. all that matters to us is the changes in the proportions over time, and whether or not those changing values correlate conceptually and schematically with the political and ideological developments on the ground, right? So I thought that you were going to ask the question about essentially the size of the population and whether or not that has a automatic impact on the ratios, right? Because some dynasties have larger population. When you have larger denominator, then you have a smaller ratio. I think there the safest assumption is to say that, so this is not about inventions per population, but it's really about the number of people who are potentially becoming inventors, potentially creative and prone to engage in inventive activities. That proportion should be a proportion of the population, right? So when the denominator increases, the numerator should also increases, right? The safest assumption is there's no change in the ratio, rather than either it is going to decline or it is going to rise, right? Unless you buy into the Malthusian logic, right, which says that population, reduces productivity and all of that. So Malthusian's logic is, is invalidated in many, many ways. And also the European data don't support Malthusian logic. In Europe, according to Joe Mulcair, the population doubled, but the agricultural productivity increased, tripled and quadrupled even more, right? So if you look at the world today, we have 7 billion people as compared with 17th century when we had, I don't know, probably less than 1 billion people. I mean, the ratio of inventions to population today are not necessarily lower than at that time, right? So there's no automatic reason why the denominator increasing should lead to a lower ratio. On the five dynasty, yeah, so that's a very good observation. So let me give a short answer. The short answer is we don't know how to explain five dynasty, because five dynasty is a period when China also had fragmentation, also had different states competing with each other, similar to the Weijin-Nanbeiqiao period. And yet, by our measure, it is very low in terms of inventions, right? So in statistical language, it is an outlier in our explanation. We don't know how to explain it. And also, I don't know much about it, about that period. And in our current book, we're asking our research assistants really to collect a lot of information about that period and try to understand that period a little bit better than we do now. Once we do that, we can answer that question. So at this point, we don't know how to explain, right? On Kuju, yeah, so it is true that the students didn't know their examiners, and the examiners didn't know their students. Except at the last stage of the exam, when the exam was held in the palace, that was not anonymized. So the emperor knew who the candidates were, and officials also knew who the candidates were. In our paper, we showed that in the provincial exam, in the metropolitan exam, family wealth didn't affect the exam performance. But in the palace stage, it affected the exam score, right? So definitely at the last stage, it affected the exam performance. And you're absolutely right that many people who already became senior bureaucrats wanted to cultivate relationship with the future bureaucrats, right? So, but they only did that during the palace stage, which is the final stage of the Kuju, rather than at the very beginning of the Kuju system. So up to the palace, stage, it was fairly meritocratic. So I grouped the questions by CDI and by Kuju. So the last question is about Kuju. So the Kuju, it's not just Kuju itself doing things to the creativity, inventive activities. One is that a sort of a rewarded different kind of human capital, right? So now it is those who can memorize Neo-Confucianist texts who get rewarded now, right? So a little bit, okay, so think about this kind of MIT and Harvard, right? Harvard, humanities, history, right? So if you're very good there, you get rewarded by getting into Harvard. MIT, science, math, right? So if you're good there, you get into MIT. When you switch from one system to another, right? Human capital formation began to change according to the parameters of the environment. So that's one effect. So now basically the memorization skill was rewarded as opposed to, say, inventive skills or mathematical skills and things like that, right? And the other is that it's simply crowded out. So those who are very good at inventions may not be very good at memorization. So they don't get into the system as much as they were before, right? And the other is that it tied up even those who fail to get into the system, right? Because you prepared, so there's one estimate that the starting age for Kuju was like 3 or 4 years old, right? So as I said before, in our database, there is a person who succeeded at the age of 69. Suppose that you are, without Kuju, you may spend that time, figuring out medicine and things like that. But with Kuju, you spend all that time preparing for Kuju, right? So essentially the time allocation changed because of Kuju. And also because of Kuju, more and more the people that, again, this is all hypothesizing, right? So people that you hang out with are all the same kind of human capital, right? So it took away the diversity of the human capital that you had before, which was very important for creativity, right? So I don't have any evidence to support that because we simply don't have data of that granularity. But that's a plausible way to reason why Kuju was detrimental to science. By the way, Needham would agree on that. Needham was extremely critical of Kuju, but his criticism is a little bit different from ours. His criticism was that Kuju shifted from having a little bit of science and math and medicine to no science and no math, to no science, no math, and no medicine, rather than the effect on creativity.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's really impressive to answer such a scope of questions so quickly and also in such a dynamic way of grouping them. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Please join us for drinks outside, and Happy New Year.
That's it.